Something dangerous is unfolding in the Middle East. Missiles are being launched, airstrikes are escalating, and some of the most powerful countries in the world are being pulled into the tension. At first glance, this may appear to be just another regional conflict in a region that has experienced instability for decades. But this situation carries a much larger risk. Because the Middle East does not only represent political conflict, it controls one of the most important systems on Earth: energy. The oil and gas flowing from this region power industries, transportation networks, and economies across the planet. And if this conflict spreads beyond its current boundaries, the consequences could reach far beyond the deserts and coastlines of the Middle East. Fuel prices in Europe could surge, manufacturing costs in Asia could rise, shipping routes across global oceans could become uncertain, and economic stability in many countries could face sudden pressure. To understand why this conflict matters so much to the entire world, we first need to understand the map. Background: the strategic importance of the Middle East. For decades, the Middle East has been one of the most strategically important regions on the planet. Part of this importance comes from geography. The region sits at the crossroads of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Major global trade routes pass near its coastlines. But the real strategic value of the Middle East lies beneath its surface. Beneath vast deserts and ancient landscapes lie some of the largest oil and gas reserves ever discovered. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates possess enormous energy resources. These resources fuel power plants, factories, transportation networks, and industries across the world. For much of the 20th century, global economic growth was closely tied to the steady supply of oil from this region. Even today, despite growing investments in renewable energy, oil remains one of the most important fuels for the global economy. But the Middle East is not only defined by energy resources, it is also defined by rivalry, political rivalry, religious rivalry, and geopolitical competition between regional powers. At the center of one of the most dangerous rivalries in the region are two powerful states, Israel and Iran. Their conflict is complex and often indirect. There is rarely a traditional large-scale war between them. Instead, the confrontation unfolds through a network of alliances, intelligence operations, cyber attacks, and proxy conflicts. Over the years, this shadow conflict has spread across several countries: Syria, Lebanon, Gaza Strip, and even the waters of the Persian Gulf. These tensions create a fragile regional balance where small events can quickly escalate into larger crises. And recently, that balance has begun to feel increasingly unstable. The global system at risk. To understand why the world pays such close attention to this region, we need to focus on one specific location: a narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, the Strait of Hormuz. At first glance, it may not seem very impressive, just a thin corridor of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. But this narrow passage controls something extraordinary. Every single day, massive oil tankers pass through this strait. These vessels carry millions of barrels of oil from the Middle East toward global markets. In fact, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through this single choke point. That means nearly 20% of global oil consumption depends on ships safely crossing this narrow waterway. And the strait itself is not very wide. In some places, the shipping lanes are only a few kilometers across, which means the global economy depends heavily on the stability of this small corridor of water. If shipping traffic here were disrupted, oil prices could surge almost instantly. And because oil fuels transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and electricity generation, the ripple effects would spread through the entire global economy. Now, imagine what happens when geopolitical tension increases around this critical system. Military forces begin moving closer to strategic positions. Naval patrols increase in the Persian Gulf. Missiles, drones, and surveillance systems become part of the regional equation. Suddenly, one of the world's most important energy corridors sits directly beside one of the most volatile geopolitical rivalries, and the risk level increases. If Iran were to threaten shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz, global oil markets would react immediately. If Israel expands military operations against Iranian targets, regional actors could become involved. And if other powers intervene, the conflict could quickly expand far beyond its original boundaries. Because the Middle East is not isolated, it sits at the center of global power competition. The United States has long maintained a powerful military presence in the region. Russia has strategic interests, particularly in Syria, and China depends heavily on Middle Eastern energy imports to fuel its industrial economy. This means that instability in this region can quickly become a global strategic concern. The chain reaction of energy disruption. But the real danger of a major Middle East conflict is not only the fighting itself, it is the chain reaction that could follow. History has demonstrated this pattern multiple times. During past crises in the region, global oil markets reacted immediately. Prices surged, financial markets became unstable, and governments rushed to secure energy supplies. Energy is one of the foundational systems of modern civilization. Without stable energy supplies, factories slow production, airlines face higher fuel costs, shipping companies raise transportation prices, and eventually those costs reach consumers. Food becomes more expensive, products become more expensive, and inflation spreads through entire economies. That is why even small disruptions in global energy supply can create massive economic consequences. Now, imagine the impact if one of the most important oil corridors on Earth suddenly becomes a conflict zone. The ripple effects would not remain in the Middle East. They would spread across continents. Global consequences. For governments, the consequences would be strategic and immediate. Countries would scramble to secure alternative energy supplies. Strategic oil reserves might be released to stabilize markets. Military forces could increase their presence in key shipping lanes, and diplomatic negotiations would intensify in an effort to prevent further escalation. But for ordinary people around the world, the effects would be far more direct. Fuel prices could rise rapidly, electricity costs could rise, transportation and shipping would become more expensive, and as those costs spread through the economy, food prices could also climb. A regional conflict in the Middle East could trigger a global economic shock, which is exactly why the region remains one of the most closely watched areas in global geopolitics. Final insight: geography and power. In geopolitics, some places matter far more than others, not because of their size, but because of the systems they control. The Middle East sits at the center of several of the most important systems on Earth: energy supply, global trade routes, and strategic geography connecting continents. Which means whenever tension rises in this region, the entire world pays attention, because what happens here rarely stays within its borders. And right now, the pressure on this system is rising once again.